Please welcome Scott Warner.
So quickly, my name's Scott Warner. I'm a game director at Ubisoft San Francisco now. I've been, as was mentioned, designing video games for about 20 years and doing a lot of different stuff. Most of it's up there in some capacity. My favorite thing is to be able to enable players to have agency in a world and do whatever they like to. Those are the kind of games I like to make. I loved the last talk because, boy, do I love Bethesda games and all the things that came before it. And to that end, I talk about my favorite games here. Does anybody remember Ultima 4, or is everybody too young? Yeah, I'm sure you are. Okay, so usually I say Red Dead Redemption 2, that's my favorite now. But there's a lot of us that came out of the early days of simulations and worlds, and we got inspired by that to go make video games, and that's kind of where I've come from. So why would we use research in the first place? Many of you probably, this is not a controversial subject to you. You know, if, for example, if you follow League of Legends, you'll know that League of Legends deeply involves the player experience. They wanted to be able to measure and understand how players play their game, so they can craft the experience and change it based on what the players want. But when I was thinking about this talk, I wasn't really thinking about games where it's already kind of a known that you use research in order to try and improve the experience. I was thinking more along the lines of a game like this. Does everybody know that one? Okay. Yeah. So probably Toby doesn't really care what you'd find from research or what you might think or whatever. He has an original, authorial experience that he wants to, craft and present to you. So why would he be interested at all in using research? After all, a lot of times when people think about research, there's a lot of skepticism that still exists today. A lot of people believe that it leads to design by committee. There's a lot of inputs from players or the internet or other folks that are going to, instead of having sort of a singular vision on things, create sort of a homogeneous experience, which also, as another potential criticism, is watered down experiences. Basically, you take all of the edgy things that people might not understand and you cut it all off in order to make something that is more accessible or something that is more, reachable by the average person. I love this comic because I think this kind of illustrates the point very well when people would think about skepticism as it relates to this sort of approach where it can go wrong. Okay, so, and when you use it incorrectly, sometimes it can lead to confirmation bias if you're not approaching it in a scientific sense. You can use things to support agendas or points of view that aren't necessarily accurate, and using the data wrong or the research wrong or incorrectly. Here are two people that you probably know, and they both had different approaches to, or one, I should say, is no longer with us, but one is still here, and had different approaches to research. Now, specifically, they're talking about market research in here. My talk is mostly about user research. But on the left, we have Bill Gates, and Microsoft's, or at least one of their taglines was, "Your potential, our passion," which roughly translates to, what does the customer want and need? So you're trying to understand, what does the customer want? We're building an application for people, and we're going to make this experience largely based on trying to solve a problem for them. Whereas Steve Jobs, he famously, or was misappropriated as saying, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Meaning that he didn't believe in research, he believed in just putting things out there, and they had the culture and passion of their own company to be able to create the products they wanted and have people love them. So of course, as creative people, when we think about these 2 points of view, there's one that clearly stands out for us, which is him. When I was working at Electronic Arts, Andrew Wilson, our CEO at the time, also when asked about this question about research, he said that he would bet on creative people every single time. And of course, we love that too. We want to just, be unchecked in our capacity to be able to create things and have them be great. So given that preamble, why would we use research at all? And what I would assert is that if you use it properly, it means your vision is going to be confirmed. So whatever your vision is, whether it happens to be making a AAA first-person shooter, or making. Has anybody played Disco Elysium yet? No. So it's a crazy role-playing game that just got released yesterday, but it is nuts. And I was just trying to think about how you might apply research to this. But basically, the reason I want to use research is I want to make sure that before my game goes out to the public, that my vision is coming through, our team's vision is coming through in the way we originally intended it. We want to use objective methods to see if our design, our creative ideas, are actually working as we intend them to. So, for example, in Undertale, one of the primary considerations of that game is that you don't want to, Toby wants it so that you don't kill people. So before that game got released, given that there is some degree of agency that's allowed to the player to make choices of how they want to, we could test Undertale and see if that's actually happening. If most people are being persuaded to not use killing as a method in order to progress to the role-playing game. And that's something we could test against to make sure that that's actually happening before we launch. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of videos. These videos are from, they're a little bit older, so I hope they still have resonance to people. But this is, the first one is a series of filmmakers, which is usually considered even a medium where there's even less testing, although, as you know, there's a lot of focus testing that happens in film. But these are three filmmakers talking about how they employ testing and how they change their famous movies to be able to accomplish the vision in the way that they intend them to.
Are you ever surprised by the reactions to your films that when you go in with an audience?
From my standpoint.
Sorry. I should say real quick, just because I didn't introduce them. The man on the left is John Landis. The man in the middle is John Carpenter, who did The Thing and, I'm forgetting the movies now, Halloween. And on the right is David Cronenberg, who does Scanners and Videodrome and a lot of famous scary movies from the 80s. And they're talking about their experience with testing.
So from my standpoint.
And I'm going to play this correctly now. There we go.
So from my standpoint, being
There we go.
Are you ever surprised by the reactions to your films that when you go in with an audience?
Oh, constantly.
Is there any particular time
I used to think that, when I was younger and more arrogant and more ignorant, certainly, I used to think the idea of having previews for films was really a bizarre, cop-out, strange industry kind of thing, and I couldn't really understand what that was about. And I later realized that there's a very good reason for it, and I realized that, I used to think, well, if a poet doesn't, go out and preview his poetry, but in fact I was wrong about that too, because poets always used to go out and read their poetry to audiences, and they would refine it afterwards, and for the very same reason. And you get so close to it after you worked on a picture for a year or 2 years or however long, that you begin to lose some kind of contact with it, and you have to vicariously experience it again through an audience so that you can really see what it is. I mean, it's almost impossible. It is impossible to walk into one of your own movies, even 30 years later, I'm sure, and see it the way anybody just walking in cold would see it. You can't see it that way. Every shot has a history, every cut has a history, every actor, every prop has a history that distorts your perception of your own film. You have to see it through other eyes, and when you do that, you are constantly being surprised at reactions to things. I mean, when it works exactly the way you thought it would, that's wonderful. It's very rare.
Have either of you actually, based on a preview, changed something very strongly?
Sure.
Like, you could tell me a story.
The Fog. I showed it to a bunch of people, and they didn't react the way I wanted them to, so I changed it.
Is that you shot some additional footage that was harder?
Quick.
I actually moved the exploding head in Scanners 10 minutes into the film. It was originally 2 minutes into the film.
It was the first scene.
Right.
And based on audience reaction to that, and the general pacing of the film, the rhythm of the film, I realized it was wrong, but I couldn't tell.
What's the biggest surprise?
So pretty interesting. I never knew that until I seen that video. Just another quick anecdote I'll play for you that's only 10 seconds long. Here's one of the most famous artists of the 20th and 21st centuries talking about the same relationship.
So from my standpoint, being an artist, I like to see what the new construction is between artist and audience. There is a breakdown. There's personified, I think, by the rave culture of the last few years, where the audience is at least as important as whoever is playing at the rave. It's almost like the artist is to accompany the audience and what the audience is doing. And that feeling is very much permeating music.
So not, just regulated to them. Obviously bands test in public all the time with their new music to see if it's working with people and iterating on it. DJs, their whole thing is about being able to have the interaction with the audience back and forth. Comedians do the same thing. They test all of their work out in public first. So this is not a brand new concept of games. Many big game franchises and types of games have used testing throughout the years. Halo kind of pioneered a user research approach to this from the very first one, where they were testing everything they possibly could to understand how players were experiencing that, and that transferred into Call of Duty, which also does a ton of research to understand how are players playing this in development to sort of see if it's working or not as they intended. Left 4 Dead famously did this with their director system to understand how players are thinking from moment to moment. There's a great talk on this in the GDC Vault where they talk about I think the most accurate measure of whether or not players were engaged or excited was sweat. They would measure sweat on the player and see how they were, feeling at any given moment during the experience. Battlefield 4 was a really famous case because Battlefield 4 on launch didn't do very well because of bad networking. And it really created a bad sort of sentiment with the community. And it took a year for them to improve or kind of course correct Battlefield 4 back into the original public sentiment that it used to have with Battlefield. And a lot of the way they did that was to directly involve the community in sort of quarterly beta releases where they formed a community, they had people come in, play those experiences, give feedback, some of it get incorporated into the game, and then those people who would be playing it would then go out and evangelize the title. So it was a kind of a direct, sort of not only user research approach to understanding how the game works, but also then involving people very directly in the creation of the game. Obviously Minecraft just, was constantly just in public, sort of a new approach rather than like kind of holding it back and not releasing something ahead of time. It was just something that was being developed, and each version would come out and people would give feedback, and the audience grew over time. And so instead of like, a private user research session, it was user research in public and just seeing what people wanted. Riot famously involves analysts in every single one of their gameplay pods, so they kind of understand what the current the current behavior of the players is, what's the information we understand about the players, how are they actually playing the game, and that can help them go and change their experience on a regular basis. And of course, mobile games do this all the time. So on research, if we are using more sort of objective information to understand the player, that also leads to better conversations with the team oftentimes, because any of you who have been involved with creative conversations with a group of people, you oftentimes go into very subjective sort of points of view of, well, the player is going to do this. No, I don't think the player is going to do that. I think the player is going to more experience this thing. People are passionate and they have opinions on things, and they oftentimes are basing it on their emotions and how they feel about things. So like, for example, we might say a feature comes out in the game and players will say, players are really going to hate this, or, the game is too difficult. The game is too easy. Like half of the team might feel one way or half of the other way. I think they'll understand this. And with user research, we get to actually have data, observation, and survey that tells us what people are actually experiencing with our game at any given time. The important thing here is that we are, as creators, never objective, and we really kind of need to see this through the eyes of other people to understand how are things working. So how do we use research properly? One thing that's really important to start before we even go into research is to be able to rely on design methodologies that will save us some time. And by that I mean that there's concepts in design. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 of them here, that if we apply this thinking to our design, we don't have to go through user research testing to understand how things work, because we've already done a good job of building things in the way where players will understand it or comprehend it better or just have a better feeling overall because they're kind of universal design principles. So one everybody probably knows is accessibility. This can mean many different things. Everything from how do we make things accessible to people with disabilities to how do we make an experience so that most people are able to approach it and understand it from the get-go. A very famous example of this is when Halo was first put on a console, this was kind of a novel approach to actually put a shooter onto a video game console instead of a PC. And in order to do that, they had to build assists into the player input in order for you to be able to play it correctly. So you may think you're awesome. Actually, you're probably pretty good at a shooter when you're firing your gun. But just in this shot alone, there's assists that are helping that reticle get closer to the target. And there's a concept called magnetism, where the bullets are getting closer to the enemy when they are being shot nearby the enemy. There's something that actually slows the player down if they're aiming on something, so that there's a slight bit of friction that gets applied to the players as they kind of strafe around. So there's all kinds of things that are happening in order to try and make it so that you just want to fire your weapon and have a good time. And we want to try and build this system so that there's nothing getting in the way of you experiencing the fantasy of playing this. Another one is relatability. So what do you think is probably the most famous movie franchise of the 20th century? Any guess? Nobody? Star Wars? Yes, there you go. So Star Wars is oftentimes a good example that people use when they think about, wow, what, unbridled creative freedom and what an imaginative universe, a wholly original thing. And oftentimes in design, when we talk about relatability, sometimes creative people will say, well, you're talking about like if you take X meets Y, then you'll have this experience people understand, but that doesn't seem particularly original. Like a good example would be at Visceral. Does anybody remember Dead Space? Dead Space's mission statement was Resident Evil in space. So if you think about it through that lens, it should become very clear like why that game is like it is. And that could seem like an unoriginal idea at first, but it actually helps creative people put a box around their thinking and then just focus on things a little bit better. So sometimes people don't like that approach and they'll say, well, Star Wars, wow, they didn't do that. That was original and it was crazy at the time. And when it came out, it was kind of a weird concept, but it's actually not true. Star Wars has got tons and tons of references that are lifted and put into science fiction. So a good example is a lot of your dogfighting sequences from Star Wars are all driven from this movie from the 50s called The Dam Busters. Dogfighting in trenches, the turrets in the background, those are all probably pretty recognizable to you. Another big reference that George Lucas always used was Kurosawa. So this is from The Hidden Fortress, and I'm sure maybe some of you will know where this is going, right? Or here's a really obvious example. This is from Yojimbo, and that gets put right into that. So using references and relatability is not necessarily a bad or unoriginal thing. It's just helping you take an idea that might be weird and then map it to some human experience or some relatable things so they can comprehend it better. Another design principle is affordance, which is the design of things affording the interaction that you're supposed to use. So obviously, cups with their handles afford being able to pick them up and drink them. This is an important concept because sometimes, when we design things, if we design them too weird or unusual, players won't intuitively understand how to use them, even if we explain or try and make them understand what they are. So, for example, the cat here probably doesn't really afford shooting a weapon. But for Halo 4, we were trying to create a number of new weapons based on this race called the Prometheans, and we kind of tied ourselves in knots trying to come up with unusual and interesting weapons. And eventually we settled on pretty relatable human forms. So this one here, what does everybody think this does? Yeah, exactly, right? So it probably doesn't make a lot of sense that, many centuries into the future that we're using shotguns still. But if you go and you look at Apex Legends, Destiny, Halo, just about every science fiction shooter, a lot of them still, use human forms because when people play things, they feel better to them, they're relatable, they know how to use them, they feel powerful. If you look at the research for Halo over the course of its history, people vastly prefer using the human weapons over the alien weapons, even if the Covenant weapons are tuned more powerful. They obviously do something better, just because the form and the function of it's more relatable to them. This was something that was important for us to consider on some of the Oculus stuff we did for onboarding for folks, was to try and make sure that the experience that people were having were something that they could relate to or had some mental model of, so that even when given a brand new input paradigm, they still knew, oh, I pick up a disk and I use this thing. Or if I interact with a certain object in the world, it works a certain way. Another concept is verisimilitude. This is a mouthful, but basically it means it feels good, or it feels right. It feels like the interaction I'm having matches what should be in my experience, and I feel good doing it. A good example of bad verisimilitude from way back in the day is, does anybody remember these two? Okay, so if you can believe it, I think this is a laser pointer, right? Yeah, that's shoot, right? And then this, of course, you put up to your ear like a taco, right? And those don't feel good. They don't feel like the interaction you would expect out of like playing a video game. So fast forward to today, and we have the modern console controller. And the reason why we have triggers is because those triggers match that trigger. And then when we put that all together in this experience, and I pull that trigger and I'm looking at something and I hit it, it's one of the best examples of verisimilitude we have, because it feels right. It feels like I'm trying to shoot a weapon and get a kill. This is a controversial one, but I believe in it. It's ludonarrative dissonance. Has anybody heard this term? Yeah, so some people love it. I happen to like it. Some people think it's too academic or just a made-up thing, but I think it's a real thing. And actually, and also to promote someone inside of my studio, my company, the creative director from Watch Dogs is the man who came up with this term. And basically, it means is the experience we're having matching the world or the narrative that's being told. And the reason that's important is because as we start to disconnect from these two things, the player's immersion gets broken. So if you're kind of deeply immersed in an experience where the fantasy is connecting with what you're doing moment to moment, it's more likely that you're going to maintain your interest and be immersed in something versus feeling like it's just a mod or something that's, not really kind of immersing you in the experience. So a good example for Ubi would be most of the Assassin's Creed games, you're an assassin. And every interaction that you have in that game largely supports the fantasy of being that assassin. And that's one of the key reasons that the game has done so well, because it really manifests that fantasy well. Versus, I worked on a game called Battlefield Hardline, and the fantasy of being a cop, at least most Americans would think that the fantasy of cop is being these guys walking down the street as beat cops and occasionally busting minor crimes and eating donuts. But when we first showed the trailer to the community at large, you saw something a little bit like this. And so when players saw that, their fantasy of what a cop should be doing is probably not mowing down people with an M4. And because the fantasy is disconnected from the world and the narrative of what you expect a cop to be, we have ludonarrative dissonance, and so we're breaking out of things. So those are just some concepts, and they're not intended to be, sort of catch-alls for all things. What I was getting at with all of these is that if we employ some of these design principles ahead of time, then we can save ourselves some time and research, because we won't have to understand why players are not being able to interact with something or intuit something well, because we will apply things that help our design better. Applying psychology to things also helps us before we go into research. Just understanding how the human mind works, how people are motivated, what their behavior around things are. These are just a couple of good examples. Some Some of these are taken from The Paradox of Choice, which is a good book to read about giving people too much choice and what happens to their brain when you do that. When you want to use research, you also want to know what you want to learn ahead of time. So, for example, using the Undertale example, you want to know, is the player playing this game and not killing things? That's our intended goal for the fantasy of the experience. We don't want to go, well, everything's possible in terms of data mining. We can go through and track every single little thing, because if you go through and you just collect a bunch of data, it's incomprehensible. Oftentimes you get a lot of things back that don't particularly help you, and it can be very confusing, and you wonder why you would ever do that in the first place. A good example of questions you might want to ask before you go into research are, can players control the character as they expected to? What percentage of players pick up a placed weapon? Where are players likely to die in the map? What's the average kill-death ratio of players who favor a particular weapon in multiplayer? Do players intuitively understand how to pick up an object? Really important in VR. Is this feature used often? Etc. These are good examples of the questions that people should ask when they go into research, rather than just saying, I want to collect a bunch of data. Don't confuse market research with user research. This is probably something you've heard a little bit. Is market research is understanding what market trends are and how that might inform what you want to make or change in the experience. And that's one way to approach things. And obviously, a lot of times creative people don't like this very much because they want to be able to create their own experiences, particularly if they're independent. User research, I see, is a very different type of research where we're trying to understand if something works or not. So just make sure you don't confuse those two. These are just some examples of market research that might be helpful. This is something that we did around the time of Halo to understand, hey, what do people expect out of a Halo campaign? What are they thinking about how they play it right now? There's quantitative and qualitative studies that can help us understand, how people are perceiving a brand or a game in a certain way, but not necessarily critical to someone trying to create an original thing, per se. Some of our user research methodologies are playtest labs. This is inside the Microsoft Games playtest lab, which I believe at this point still, it has like the capacity to have 48 people playing at the same time. It's a really, really nice setup, and everybody's playing there so we can observe them and see how they're playing the experience at a given time and seeing what they're reacting to and how they're playing our experience. A lot of times our games have data mining that we then pull out to telemetry, and so we can make visually interesting things that sort of help us make decisions. This is a classic heat map where people are dying. I know how useful this one is because everyone's dying everywhere, but maybe it's balanced. Maybe a better example is, this is a map in Halo 3 where it's the color coding is showing you the time it's taking for people to progress from one area to another. So what you could sort of derive from this telemetry would be, are people spending too long in one particular area? Is it seeming to be too challenging or too confusing for them to navigate? There's also survey, which is basically, we have data and we can see what people are actually doing, but then when we actually survey them, their answers might be quite different. So in this case, just using the particular last one, we said, where am I supposed to go? Did you understand? So out of 1 out of 5, this particular one, it seemed like most people understood where they were going in each one of the missions, or in this case, episodes. So survey is another way we look at things. There's other methods as well. We can do eye tracking to understand where people are looking at a screen. Particularly useful when we talk about people interacting with menus and shells. You can measure heartbeats. There's all kinds of different things you can do in order to try and understand how people are playing things. Research is not going to design your experience for you. So this is, of course, everybody's worst nightmare, is that when you think about research and you go to user research, that you're going to get this, and you're going to go, hey, user, what do you think? How should this game be made? And obviously, no one ever wants to do this. Because if you do this, for example, if I were to go in on the original Halo, which famously only allowed you to carry 2 weapons at a time, say, well, how many weapons would you like to carry, player? What do you think they say? There you go, all of them, and customize them, and unlimited ammo. and everything else, right? And naturally, when you do things like that, then you end up with this, right? So that's a no-no. Set expectations. User research does not guarantee success. I mean, it'd be great if we went through and everything worked and people loved the game and we came out with Grand Theft Auto 5 every time, but that's not the way it works. You know, it could be a really great experience and then go out into the marketplace, and particularly in the modern era, you know, there can be one meme or another, or one opinion or another that sort of becomes top of mind to people, and it colors how people see the experience altogether. So it's just a best line of defense that the vision's getting out in the way you intend it to before it actually hits the players, but it doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be completely solving all of your problems. And working with an external accredited research team is great. As I'll explain later, if you don't have this, it's still better than nothing to do your own research and do your own testing, but really you should be working with a team that is removed from your development team, that is trained in research, that understands how to run tests and give you the right results in order for you to get the best scientific results. Because again, as we pointed out before, creators are not objective. So if you run your own test, you are run into the possibility that you're going to bias the results in some way. So you should use the experts, right? So here's a few case studies where I'm going to talk to you directly about how we applied user research and some things that I worked on. And you can see how user research was applied. So Jetpacks in Halo 4 is the first one, which is going back some time now. We put Jetpacks into Halo 4, and internally at our team, we immediately ran into an issue. So Jetpacks are obviously good fantasy. Seems like something that would support the Spartans, that would be part of their outfits. People generally like jetpacks. But the team's perception, or at least a chunk of the team's perception, was if you use a jetpack, your KD ratio goes up. KD ratio being kill-death ratio, the primary way we measure success oftentimes in first-person shooters. And so the assertion was that because skilled players would have verticality, they would get the jetpack and just be able to dominate everybody that they'd be playing against right away. So like, you know, this is actually kind of a bad image, but it's meant to be a shotgun with a jetpack firing down on somebody, right? But as we looked into the data, we actually saw this, which is that when people would pick up the jetpack, their kill-death ratio would start going down. Anybody want to know why? Anybody have a guess? That's mobility. You're right. Okay, good. That's exactly why. So basically, with the way that we tune the jetpack, you weren't like a flying saucer that can immediately just kind of go in every direction all the place. You have far less mobility, where somebody on the ground has many, many different ways they can sort of move around and avoid things. So while you do get a vertical advantage, you're also a slow-moving arc through the sky usually, and it makes it easy for expert players to shoot you. So if we had not used research to confirm this, we might kind of just decide, hey, the jetpacks are something we take out because experts are just going to dominate everybody, and it wasn't true. In fact, actually, it's in some ways it's one of the best balanced features because players have the perception that it's very powerful and it's great fantasy, but then over time, the experts realized maybe I shouldn't use that thing. So it's an interesting feature. Second one, we put, so in Battlefield Hardline, did anybody play that game? A few people? Okay, yeah. It's not the most popular Battlefield that went out, but I had the luxury of working on it. And we incorporated a lot of features sort of midstream in order to try and highlight the fantasy of being a cop. And one of those features was called freeze. So freeze basically was put your badge up, and threats in front of you would put their hands up in certain situations that you understood. So in sort of using movie history, like there's nothing more cop than this. Everybody's seen it many, many times. Someone telling somebody to freeze and pointing their gun at them. A good thing about this feature in terms of some of the design principles we were talking about before is it incorporated the gun. So the way that you actually did the freeze feature still used kind of your first-person controls in the way that you were familiar with. So it was an easy feature to sort of learn and use. It was another option other than killing. I'm not morally opposed to shooting and killing things in games, but it is interesting to be able to do other things and have other verbs and interactions that we can do. So we love the idea that we were able to present something that you could do other than shoot your weapon. And so in theory, this is the perfect feature for a cop fantasy. So we put it into the game, and the team was freezing people left and right, and they thought it was just a great win, amazing. People are going to totally keep doing this, all the way up to our VP level. Everybody thought this was just the greatest thing they had seen. And it had some issues. So this was the first version of it. And this is actually a version where you could put your hands up, and the way our team put it is that you could fail this in 16 different ways. So beyond just being able to sort of point your gun and tell someone to arrest, you could actually put your hands up and also try and get out of a hostile situation. So when we ran this through tests, we found something pretty interesting, which is that players didn't care. They said, how often do you use this feature? And it was mostly rarely. That's strange. Everybody on the team's using this feature. Why aren't players using this feature? Right? And when we got to the survey part of user research, they said, why wouldn't I just shoot someone? And this version where you put your hands up, that's just going to get you killed. Why would I do that? I still have a gun. So why am I doing this? And as we looked into it, it was obvious that the version where we were putting your hands up seemed like the least cop thing you could possibly do. It's like you're supposed to be controlling the situation, and instead you're putting your hands up in some ways. And players just really didn't like this. When I look at a feature in research, I oftentimes look at it in three ways, which is, do you comprehend it? Do you use it over time? And do you actually have fun with this thing? And for the put your hands up version, we didn't even have comprehension. So that helped us make a very early decision, just to get rid of that part. Cut that, that's not working at all. But we still thought that the feature around being able to put your gun at someone and have them put their hands up was part of the fantasy. We just had to find out what was the right combination of design and persuasion to get people to use this. So what we did was we went back and we did what I often do in my video game productions is we build research into the process. So we have a design plan, which is we have an idea for what we're doing. And then we build the design around that. We integrate it. We play test it with a team to make sure everybody feels like that we've gone in the right direction. And then we try to do external validation through research to make sure that our vision is coming through as we intend it. Then we get our results back from that. We see if that's working or not. And then we plan again until we get this working the way that we want it to. So for this particular feature, like I was saying before, we didn't really have adoption of it. And so we had to go through a variety of different tests in order to try and figure out how we can motivate people to do it. So one thing that we did was we realized that oftentimes people didn't understand who they could freeze and when, and we were trying to make it very diegetic and in-world and do it mostly based on sort of animation states and AI behavior. And eventually we just, at this time actually Shadows of Mordor was out and I was playing that. There's a lot of AI state things happening in there as well. And they basically just rely on user interface in order to tell the player explicitly what's happening. It's less elegant, but it's obvious. And so we, given the time that we had left, we went, okay, if you can freeze these people, we're going to go ahead and put the targets above their head and say, you can do this. Another thing we did was we killed two birds with one stone and involved your partner. So oftentimes in this game, when you were playing the campaign, you would have an AI partner with you, and so it's a buddy cop theme. And for a while, people weren't feeling that the partners were particularly useful. And so what we did is we involved the partners directly with those freeze moments. So if you actually freezed a character and we're going to go then handcuff them, in the handcuffing process, the camera would pivot down like this, and then it would come back up. Your partner would be boop, right next to you and aiming their gun at the enemy. And it was possible for the enemy to heat up if you weren't putting your gun on them, and eventually they might shoot you. And so if they did that, your partner would immediately shoot them, so they made the partner be perceived as more useful. And then, this is one of the, going back to player psychology, one of the oldest tricks in the book, but basically we favored the metagame around arresting people. So to show you how powerful metagaming can be, all of your rewards you got for arresting people in the game were more weapons. But the game was was incentivizing you not to kill people. Still, people did it anyway. So basically, they wanted to accumulate all these weapons they could possibly use, but most of their interactions in the game were non-lethal or arresting people. So pretty interesting. So when we put it all together, it looked a little bit like this.
I heard Nels had hired a crew from
Tell these guys to freeze.
Freeze! The guys shooting up the place. Who are they? I don't know. I think it's the same cycles hit. Fucking cop. Kai!
Got your back, Nick.
So after we did all of that, we started doing our last user research test before we shipped the game. Players pretty much understood exactly how to use it. They kept using it throughout the entire campaign, and they really liked using it. So had we not used research and incorporated it into our feature iteration to try and understand how players would use this, we would have had a feature that no one would have used. We might have been better off cutting it, but instead we built something that people actually wanted to use. So a great success for user research for us there. One other example I'll use is I was part of the team that built the onboarding new user experience for the Oculus touch controllers. Has anybody seen the robot demo? Played that before? Okay, so here's just a quick trailer for it. It's just to give you some idea what it is. In theory. Oh, you know what? That's a YouTube video. That's what's going on. Okay. Let me go. I'll go forward. So we had to deal with a new input paradigm. So nobody had ever used a touch input device for VR before, so we're a completely brand new way of interacting with software and hardware. We had to onboard new users to a new input paradigm in minutes, so this couldn't be something that took hours or whatnot. We had to kind of make sure that we could get people to understand how to use these things really, really fast. And Oculus only really had 3 user researchers to dedicate to everything, which blew my mind. At EA and Microsoft, we would have really large teams of dozens of people to help us out. But at this new hardware effort, where we're kind of doing this brand new way of experiencing things, really we didn't have a very large user research department, which meant that we had to end up doing a lot of it ourselves. So when I was talking about doing scientific testing before, that's what you should prefer, but you shouldn't eschew testing altogether if you don't have what you need. Most of the testing done to launch that out to the world was done by me, a couple of other designers, and just pulling in internal resources from Facebook to play and experience and sort of see how they were experiencing with the new user experience we were putting together. We need to do it all ourselves. So I wish I had an image of our testing, but I don't. So trust us, we did it all ourselves. Some VR knowns in 2017. Vection is an unsolved problem, so don't try and solve it for a new user experience. Anybody know what vection is? So that's when your brain realizes that something's weird going on in VR, and the camera's moving, but I'm standing right here because I'm locomoting or I'm doing something else like that. And what the theory is that your brain says, that's not weird, or that is weird, and I think I'm getting poisoned. And so that's what makes people throw up. So we knew as kind of an onboarding team, we're not going to try and solve that problem or even try and tackle anything. We have to make this experience for everybody. So whatever we do, we're going to keep the player stationary. Character interaction is great in VR to a point. I mean, like when you see characters in VR, they're very vivid and wonderful. But if you start to try and interact with them, that immersion is going to break down very quickly because we can't support all the kind of ways you'd want to try and touch and prod and throw things at a character. Most people at this time were using 2 by 2 meter area setups for their VR setups. So they weren't moving around in large spaces. They were largely confined to their tables. So we had to build the experience based around that. So we decided to build like a cute little workshop onboarding thing that would sort of take the initial instruction you got for using the controllers and sort of build something to help you reinforce that in a very controlled setting. And we really wanted you to be able to interact with the character. So we built this robot, and he's actually quite complicated compared to a regular sort of shooter video game character. but we can't have, like I was saying before, we can't have you try and like start interacting with it in a deep way because you might want to start pulling its arm or its head or slapping it or whatever. And that's not going to work because we're not going to be able to support all those kind of game states. So what we tried to do was build both the character such that it would give a personality that made so that it didn't want to be interacted with as much. So we tried to make the robot timid, and then we tried to confine the space so that there was some distance between you and the robot. So here's an example of what it looks like. So there we're trying to set the context for why the robot keeps backing up and is timid from you and trying to solve a problem as well. So characters are very powerful in VR. If you can use monkey see, monkey do, which is the character does something to demonstrate its functionality to you, and then you learn how to do it as well. It's very powerful in all video games experiences. Oftentimes players get things really fast when you do that. But if you do not control the possibility space, immersion will be broken. So if you try and interact with the robot in deeper ways, then obviously like you're not going to be able to, and that's going to be frustrating to you. So one other thing that we learned through a lot of UR testing is that when people are put in virtual reality spaces, they don't violate their human mental model of how things work. So one thing, for example, they wouldn't do is if they saw a solid thing in front of them, like this desk you're going to see here in a minute, when we did testing, nobody, and I mean to a fault, like nobody of all the participants we did, like 70, 80 people, would ever walk through the table even though they could. So that allowed us to put some distance between the player and the robot and have the experience be something that the players wouldn't easily break it. So test learnings that we came from were players do not violate their mental model of how the world works, as I was saying. Any object that should afford action definitely should. So when we're thinking about building a VR space, it becomes even more highlighted that players feel like they want to be able to interact with everything that's in the space. So when you think about constructing for that, you know, if you put something in they feel like they should be able to pick up and use, they have to, or immersion will get broken as well. Allowing for a lot of controlled, varied character interaction works great, and players were delighted with the experience that we put together and knew how to use it pretty quickly. Most people, even if they were sort of not video gamers, but very, very new to just any kind of, and now we're putting it inside of VR, most people were able to sort of comprehend and know how to use this and interact with the robot very quickly. And very quickly, because I realize I'm running on time here, mode discovery in Halo 4. So this is a question of like basically how you present information to players can actually be problematic if you weren't thinking about it carefully. So when we launched the game, we had a PvE experience in the game called Spartan Ops, and we were noticing the number of people playing it was pretty low. The idea tested really well during development. People loved the idea of it. User research loved the idea of it when we put it into to playing with players. And the mode was viewed very favorably when described at focus test. So after we launched the game, we would describe what this mode was, and players would say, yeah, I would love to play that. But even people who owned the game didn't even know they had it. And so why is that? We dug into it. Like, why is it that some owners don't even know they had it? And one of the key reasons was on the main menu, previous Halo games had described the options you had was campaign, multiplayer, theater, forge, right? So we had changed all this to contextualize multiplayer a little bit more for this release. And we changed it to War Games, which is multiplayer, and Spartan Ops, which was the PvE thing. And a lot of people thought Spartan Ops was like character customization or some kind of more advanced sort of user-generated content or something that they normally wouldn't use. So a lot of people didn't even know they had this other big chunk of game there and didn't even get to it because the menu option prevented them or didn't communicate clearly to them what was available to them. Another good example of this was Madden 25. So a lot of, when they put this out, they had kind of a new connected franchise feature. And you can see it says play online or offline as an owner, coach, or player. Well, it turns out a lot of these Madden players don't like to play with other people online. I didn't know that. And they just saw connected franchise play online. They said, oh, you're changing our game, so now we have to play with people all the time. That sucks. And they're like, no, it's also offline. But just in the actual wording here, many, many people thought that the game had completely changed and now was only going to be an online experience. So again, research would have caught that, but this was not tested before it went out. So closing, I'll go fast here. User research can be very useful to almost every creative endeavor. It helps you see your experience through the eyes of the audience. It makes creative conversations and decisions easier because you're not just basing it on a hunch. You're getting actual objective information. It highlights problems that may not be immediately apparent, just like the menu I just showed you there. And it's more effective when you use design principles that get some of the noise out of the research that you might encounter ahead of time. And importantly, it will not compromise your vision. The important thing to take away from this talk is it doesn't matter whether your vision is not killing things in a role-playing game or people having a good shooting experience or you making a good lawnmower simulation. The point is, how do you ensure that people are playing the game in the way you want them to? And a great way to do that is user research. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely fantastic talk. Now, I know we are sort of out of time, but as we're heading into lunch, I think we could take a couple of very quick questions if anyone had anything.
And I'll be wandering around too. You can ask me questions.
Okay, do you want to pop down to the mic? Okay.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, since most of us here are very small companies and we don't have user research departments and stuff, in your experience or talking to other developers, like, what's a good approach for somebody with a very small budget to incorporate some kind of user research?
Test it yourself, and trying to understand some of the research principles around bias and making sure that you're trying to take an objective approach to things. If you can get people inside the community or your friends or anybody who's external to what you're making and have them play things and just see how they fiddle around with things, if they understand what you're trying to present them without any information, just observe and watch how they experience things, that can be a cost-effective way about doing things. It probably, like, if you grab friends who have never played video games before to come over and say, try this out, and they're not experiencing the game in the way that you intend them to, then you already know that you have something you have to course correct. So you can do that without having a giant user research department or data analytics or anything else.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. So I taught video games for 15 years, and I thought that talk was like a masterclass that I wish my students could have seen. So some fantastic information, particularly for any students in the audience. So thank you very much.